This summer on the show, we're going to be putting corporate culture on the hot seat. With high-profile disasters like the BP oil spills and the Syncrude dead ducks in the news, there is growing cynicism about the corporate world. Our guest for the next few weeks will be John Larsen. He is a principal with the Corpen Group, a public relations firm in Calgary specializing in crisis management. John joins me now to talk about corporate crises in the news. Good morning, John.
Good morning, Jennifer.
It does seem like we're hearing about more crises in the business world, but do you think that bears out in fact, or is that just a result of more media coverage?
It's a little bit of both. There actually are more crises occurring. There are all kinds of reasons for that. I mean, one of those is technology. Technology is in every single part of our lives, and when one single link in that technology chain breaks down, it causes all kinds of problems. I mean, we just saw here last week, for example, Apple with this antenna gate and how the CEO had to get out in front of that really quickly and explain it to consumers. So we see these things. We've seen technology, the BP oil spill as an example. So that is generating more crises. One of the other things is regulatory change. As we continue to progress, regulatory standards get higher. And so you would think that in a way that actually causes fewer crises. But in some respects, it actually causes more because with the regulatory standards higher, we simply cannot get away with what we used to get away with just a couple of years ago even. So things that happen today that wouldn't have been deemed a crisis earlier are now deemed a crisis because the bar is higher.
Well, and you mentioned the iPhone. Is that a crisis, or is that just the consumers becoming aware of it so quickly and jumping on it so quickly that it almost becomes like a crisis?
Indeed, and that's a very good point. There is an entire new era now of social media and what I would call a citizen journalist, where people are jumping on all of these things, and it's out there on the social media network, and people are responding to it, and CEOs have to respond to it as well. And so that's really where the perception of crisis comes into it. You know, the other thing is values. People's values continue to change. I mean, we've had discussions on this program before about environmental attitudes towards environmental crises. So that as well is fueling a perception that more and more crises are occurring.
But you say it's not just perception; it actually is a reality as well.
That's right. There are more happening, and those that are happening are getting intense scrutiny, and those that wouldn't be deemed crisis before are being driven into that crisis category because of our value propositions around them and the way social media is doing that.
And yet companies, I think, like BP, talk about these crises as though they're accidents that were unavoidable. Do you think that's true?
There will always be some element of accident in some of these crises. I mean, certain things literally just are not preventable. Having said that, I think companies really need to go the extra mile to make sure that they're doing everything possible to mitigate against crises occurring. Again, not to pick on BP because it seems to be the flavor of the day, but even now as this thing is getting capped and it looks like we're hopefully nearing the end of a solution, we can look back quite systematically and say, were the right steps taken to mitigate against that? And there are a lot of people out there that are suggesting that they weren't. And so to just arbitrarily use the word accident, I think people will be held to much higher account in the future than they have been in the past.
How well do you think companies like Apple and BP have handled their corporate crises? I mean, they're obviously not of the same scale. And, the glitches in the iPhone have very little to do with a large spill in the Gulf. But just from a PR standpoint, how well do you think they've handled their separate issues?
It really depends on the company. Every company has handled it differently. I mean, we look at Apple, they're a fairly progressive company. They have a lot of public support. BP has been chastised for having a record of safety instances in the past. Just a few months ago, we looked at Toyota. A lot of people were surprised at the crisis around Toyota because of the history there. So every company handles it differently. It really comes right from the executive table. It's how forward-leaning are we going to be on this? How transparent are we going to be? How immediate are we in our action to it? And that's where people make their value judgments.
And if a company like BP maybe hasn't done that all that well, can you think of an example where a company did deal well with a terrible incident?
There have been actually quite a few. We tend to focus on the companies that have done it badly. I mean, we can go back just a few years to early part of this decade when the second shuttle blew up there in 2003 with Columbia. NASA had been roundly criticized for not doing a good job in 1986 when Challenger exploded. In 2003, they did a great job. Such a great job, in fact, that CNN actually did a special feature on how well well they communicated around that crisis. In Canada, more recently, we don't need to look very far back, just to last year, we had the Michael McCain and the Maple Leaf food crisis. And that was generally accepted by most people to be really, really well handled. And in fact, their market share has jumped back within a year. So again, they were out there early. It wasn't overly polished in terms of their response to that. It looked very sincere. They had a dialogue with Canadians about it, and they got back on track.
Well, and is it about looking sincere, or is it about being sincere?
Absolutely. It's about being sincere, but part of that is the projection that you put out there, and it's very difficult because oftentimes for these companies, people don't know who they are. And when we look at Apple and we look at Steve Jobs, people know who that character is. But for other companies, for very good reason, they're not in the public eye every day. Mm-hmm. And so you need to be a peer, but you also need to very strongly put the effort behind projecting that. And that's not just in what you say, it's in how you follow up, and it's the actions you take, and it's in the advocacy that you can bring to those efforts.
John, thanks very much for joining us.
Thank you so much. My pleasure.